Sew a waistcoat with me today. No zippers or buttons for a simple style, and it's beautifully finished with a full lining. This is a free PDF download from Unfettered Patterns. I have used a medium weight cotton blend for the main fabric and a lightweight rayon for the lining. I've sewn the smallest size here, and it was under a yard of fabric for both main and lining. This vest makes a great layering piece, easy to mix and match with other tops in your wardrobe. Sew this classic style with me. Let's get started. I've applied interfacing to the wrong sides of my front and back facing pieces. Now I'll place them right sides together and pin at the shoulder seams. Sew these seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Place your main back pieces right sides together and pin the center seam. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Place your front pieces right sides together with the back piece at the shoulders and pin in place. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Place your facing right sides together with the center front and the neckline pinning in place all the way around. Then we'll sew from the bottom of the center front all the way around the neckline to the opposite bottom edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then we can press that seam toward the facings. Now that the facing is attached to the main garment, we're going to understitch the facing. Turn the facing over its seam allowance, and with that seam allowance still pressed toward the facing, we're going to sew the facing to its seam allowance about 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line, doing this understitching all the way around. Place your back lining pieces right sides together, pin and sew that center back seam at 3/8 of an inch. Press the seam open. Then place your front lining pieces right sides together with this back lining piece. Pin the shoulder seam, sew at 3/8 of an inch and press the seams open. Place your lining and main right sides together and pin the armholes on both sides. Sew from one outer edge across the shoulder seam to the opposite outer edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, repeating on both sides. Here are the front bottom edges of my lining and my main pieces. For the lining, I'm going to press the bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 1 inch just to form a memory crease for both front lining pieces. Now that I have those bottom facing edges pressed to the wrong side by 1 inch, I'm going to pre-press the longest bottom edges of the main piece to the wrong side by its hem allowance of 1.5 inches. This will also allow us to press the edges of this indented portion by 3/8 of an inch. Do this for both sides. Now we're going to sew our lining to the facing on the inside, placing them right sides together and pinning all the way around. Now we'll sew the facing to the lining all the way around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam toward the facing. We're going to be starting and stopping our stitching at that 1 inch crease that we created in the lining on both sides. Backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitches. Now with the facing still right sides together with the front piece, we're going to pin this bottom indented portion, making sure your facing is folding along its main seam line. Also make sure that your inner facing seam allowance is toward the facing. With your lining fabric out of the way, we're going to sew the facing to the front piece here with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, starting at this inner 3/8 of an inch fold at the bottom of the facing. Sew over the fold to the outer edge of the facing. Repeat for both sides. Now we can take the bottom raw edge of the lining and pull it down so that it meets the bottom raw edge of the main fabric. And pin in place. Sew those bottom edges together at 3/8 of an inch. Fold the bottommost seam allowance at the corner toward the facing and then turn this section right side out. Now you can see we have a nice finished edge along the bottom main fabric and the finished edge of the lining on the inside, which has some ease in that seam allowance. You'll also see that we have a gap here in our stitching at the side of the facing. We're going to edge stitch along that gap just on the facing, not stitching through the front of the garment. So spread the main and the facing fabric apart at that bottom edge so you can cleanly edge stitch along that gap in your stitching. Do the same for both sides. Here are the bottom edges of my back main and back lining pieces, and I've gone ahead and pressed up the hem allowances in the same way as I did for the front pieces. You'll press the raw edges of the main piece to the wrong side by 1.5 inches just to form a memory crease, and you'll fold and press the raw edges of the lining to the wrong side by 1 inch. Align the raw edges along the bottom and pin in place. Sew the bottom edge at 3/8 of an inch. Turn everything right side out through your open side edges. Now we can close our side seams. Place your front and back vest pieces right sides together. Align the top and bottom of the side seams and pin in place. At the bottom there, you're just aligning those memory creases that we pressed earlier. Now I'll reach inside the jacket through the back side seam opening and pull out that opposite side seam. Now with our initial landmarks pinned in place, you can continue pinning all the way around. Sew this circle with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that that side seam is sewn, we can turn this section back right side out. Now that side seam is cleanly finished on the outside and on the inside. For the opposite side seam, we're going to place those materials right sides together in the same way as we did on the other side. We're going to be sewing that same circle at 3/8 of an inch all the way around. Since we've closed all the other seams at this point and we're limited to how far we can turn this fabric inside out, we're not going to be able to sew the full circle. I'm going to start by pinning the lining fabrics right sides together. Accessing those lining fabrics through the front main fabrics. I'm going to leave a gap in my stitching of about 1.5 inches on the lining side only, so I can start and stop my stitches on either side of the gap and start sewing your circle from opening to opening with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now pull that fabric out through the opening to turn this right side out. So for the outside of that second side seam, you should now have a nice finish. And on the inside, you'll have an opening in your stitches. Tuck the seam allowances of the opening to the inside and pin in place. We're going to edge stitch just as far as that opening section to seal the lining on the inside. Now your lined vest is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.